A trial was about to unfold that would captivate the entire community. In the small town of Hollow Rock, it wasn't just about murder. It was about a woman, a nameless servant girl who stood alone against a world that had already decided her fate. From the moment she stepped into the courthouse with dirt on her hem and no one by her side, it was clear justice had already abandoned her. The townsfolk gathered not for the truth, but for the spectacle, eager to witness the unraveling of a life that had never mattered to anyone. The girl, poor and silent, had spent her life in the shadows of the town, forgotten by all except the wealthy and cruel mayor Frederick Hawk, who had hired her to work in his home. Now he was dead, poisoned, and the fingers of accusation were pointed squarely at her. She didn't plead her case, she didn't scream or cry for Clara. She simply walked her head lowered, letting them drag her out of the mayor's house in chains. The only thing she had left was her silence. A silence that spoke volumes about the life she had led. But it wasn't the crime that had drawn the crowd. It was who she was. Or more accurately, who she wasn't. She had no family to stand by her, no husband to speak for her. She was just the girl who worked in the mayor's house, an invisible figure with bruises hidden under her plain clothes. The prosecutor painted her as a bitter servant, scorned and resentful. What kind of woman doesn't cry when her employer dies in her arms? He shouted, his voice rising in anger. The crowd, eager for drama, hissed and whispered their judgment. No one questioned how a poor servant could afford poison. No one asked why the mayor had rewritten his will just days before his death. The town had already decided she was guilty. In the courtroom, the judge, an old friend of the deceased, leaned heavily toward loyalty rather than justice. The defense attorney, barely competent, stammered through his arguments. He was no match for the prosecutor's fiery rhetoric. The jury, already swayed by gossip and speculation, didn't need to deliberate. The girl's fate had been sealed long before the trial began. As the gavel slammed down, the girl was led away. Her hands shackled, her future uncertain. The trial wasn't just a search for truth. It was a spectacle, a chance for the town to indulge in the gossip they had long whispered in hushed tones. They had watched her silently suffer for years, and now they could sit in judgment. They believed they knew her story, but the truth was far from what they expected. In Hollow Rock, the line between justice and theater was thin, and the woman at the center of it all was nothing more than an unfortunate pawn in a game she never wanted to play. And yet, as the trial continued, something changed. A man, a gunslinger with a past as dark as the town itself, would soon walk into the saloon, and everything would begin to unravel. The truth, long buried under lies and silence, was about to be heard. But for now, the girl remained alone, waiting in the shadows of the courthouse, unaware that the town's whispers would soon give way to a much louder voice. The voice of a man who would stand up for her when no one else would. In Hollow Rock, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, but one figure remained painfully silent amidst the chaos, the woman at the center of it all. She was a servant girl, poor and alone, standing trial for a crime she did not commit, and yet she was the only one who seemed to understand the harsh reality of her situation. The townspeople, drawn to the courthouse by a combination of morbid curiosity and gossip, already had their minds made up about her. They saw only a nameless servant, the girl who worked at the mayor's house, not the woman who had suffered quietly in the shadows for years. From the moment she entered the courtroom, dust clinging to the hem of her dress, and no one by her side, it was clear that the trial was not about truth or justice. It was about spectacle. No one stood up for her. Not a single person spoke in her defense. She had no father, no husband, no family to claim her. Her name meant nothing to anyone. She was only known by her role, just another faceless servant in a town that had long turned a blind eye to her existence. The town's judgment had already been passed before the trial even began. Throughout the proceedings, she remained eerily silent. Her face, pale and unreadable, offered no emotion. She did not plead for her innocence, nor did she cry out in protest. She simply sat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture rigid and still. Her silence was not an act of defiance. It was a silent testament to the life she had lived, a life of neglect, abuse, and isolation. For her, speaking was useless. The town had long since made up its mind about her, and no words could change that. She had learned from a young age that silence was safer, that disappearing into the background was her only way of surviving. As the trial continued, the prosecutor's words painted a picture of a bitter servant scorned by a cruel master. His accusations were sharp, his voice rising with each word. He spoke of a woman who was jealous and resentful, a woman who had no place in the world except as a servant in the mayor's house. He asked the jury how any woman could fail to cry when her employer died in her arms. His words were like daggers cutting through the room, but the woman did not react. She did not flinch, did not show the slightest sign of emotion. It was as if she had been stripped of her humanity, reduced to nothing more than the sum of the accusations against her. The courtroom watched her, waiting for a reaction, but all they saw was her quiet submission. She did not scream. She did not beg for Clara. The townspeople, once familiar with her presence in the mayor's house, now looked at her with judgment and disdain. The baker's wife, the stable boy, the sheriff, none of them were willing to speak out for her. Even the housemaid who had seen the bruises and the cook who had heard the fights stayed silent. They all had something to lose, something to protect, and so they turned away. The woman was nothing more than a casualty in their eyes, a convenient scapegoat for a crime they were all too eager to forget. She had been a servant her whole life, and in Hollow Rock a servant's life meant nothing. Her identity was tied to the house she worked in, the mayor's house, a place where she had been mistreated and ignored. She had been nothing more than an object to be used, a tool to clean and serve, with no voice, no agency, and no place in the world beyond the walls of that house. And when the mayor died, when the world she had come to know began to unravel, she was the only one left to take the blame. The truth of her suffering, of the years of abuse and neglect, was ignored in favor of a quick, easy judgment. No one cared that she had never been given a choice, that she had been trapped in a life she had not asked for. No one cared that she had been forced to endure the mayor's cruelty in silence day after day, because there was no one to protect her, no one to listen. Her silence in the courtroom was not the silence of guilt. It was the silence of someone who had learned long ago that speaking out only led to pain. She had seen the way people turned their backs on her, how they pretended not to notice the bruises on her arms, or the weariness in her eyes. She had been invisible for so long that it felt almost natural to remain unnoticed, to stay in the background, and let the world move around her. But the silence was not just her defense. It was her armor. She had no words to offer, no explanations, because no one had ever cared to listen. She was just the girl at the mayor's house, the quiet one with the hollow eyes, and that was all anyone saw. Even her court-appointed defense lawyer barely spoke on her behalf. His arguments were weak, half-hearted, as if he too had already resigned himself to the idea that she was guilty. His apology to the jury for the lack of evidence was barely audible, as if he was too ashamed to even try. It was as if the woman's fate had already been sealed before the trial began, and no one was willing to challenge the story that had been so carefully constructed by the town. As the trial continued, she sat there still and silent, her mind a whirl of memories of a life lived in the margins. She thought back to when she was 8, when her mother had died in childbirth, leaving her with a father who drank himself to death by the time she was 12. She thought of the 5 homes she had lived in before ending up at the mayor's mansion, each one more cruel than the last. She had never known kindness, only survival. She had never been allowed to be more than what others saw her as, a servant, a nameless girl with no voice. The prosecutor's words were like fire, but they couldn't burn her. Her silence had been forged in the fires of her past, a shield against a world that had never cared for her. She had learned that silence was the only way to protect herself, the only way to make it through another day without being consumed by the cruelty around her. And so as the trial continued, she remained quiet, because silence was all she had left. It was the one thing the town could not take from her. In the end, the woman's isolation was not just physical, it was emotional, psychological, and societal. She had been abandoned by everyone, even by those who had witnessed her suffering. Her silence was the result of a lifetime of neglect, a lifetime of being invisible. But as the trial moved toward its inevitable conclusion, there was a glimmer of hope. A man, a legend from the past, was about to walk into the saloon and change everything. The courtroom was thick with tension, the air heavy with the murmurs of a town eager to see justice served, or at least a spectacle played out before them. The prosecutor, a man who wore his confidence like a well-tailored suit, stepped forward to present his case. His voice rang out with the authority of someone who had already decided the verdict before the trial had even begun. He didn't need to convince anyone in the room of the woman's guilt. The town had already made up its mind. They believed him because they wanted to. From the very first moment he spoke, the prosecutor painted a damning picture of the woman. She was not a person, not a victim of circumstance, but a bitter, vengeful servant. Someone who had been wronged by a rich and cruel master, and now in her quiet bitterness had struck back with deadly force. He described her as someone with eyes that never blinked enough. Someone who had harbored secrets and resentments waiting for the right moment to act on them. He raised a small bottle dark and menacing as if it were a talisman, a symbol of the woman's guilt. "This here," he shouted, "is belladonna, the devil's herb. A single drop can kill a man in his sleep, and that's just what she did." He brandished the bottle to the jury, his voice rising in excitement, feeding off the crowd's eager anticipation. The room was captivated, hanging on his every word. It wasn't about the truth. It was about the narrative he wove, one that fit neatly into the town's expectations. The crowd hissed, murmured, and nodded in agreement as the prosecutor continued to accuse her of the mayor's death. He made it sound like a story everyone had heard before. Rich, cruel man, poor, resentful servant, and an inevitable act of violence. But he didn't care for the details, the facts that might have cast doubt on his neatly packaged tale. He didn't mention that the bottle of poison was found in the mayor's own drawer, nor did he address the fact that the mayor had been growing weaker for months before the fatal night. The slow, steady decline in his health, the signs of a sickness that no one had questioned, were conveniently left out of the prosecutor's narrative. It didn't fit. It didn't serve the story he wanted to tell. The prosecutor's words were meant to be the final word, the answer that the townsfolk were waiting for. His narrative cast the woman as the villain, the murderer, the one to blame. But it wasn't just his story. It was the town's story. They wanted to believe it. They needed to believe it. After all, how else could they reconcile the death of a man like Mayor Frederick Hawke, a man whose cruelty was whispered about but never openly challenged? It was easier to accept the prosecutor's account than to admit that the mayor had been a man capable of creating his own demise, a man whose power was not enough to protect him from the world he had built. The prosecutor had no real proof. There was no concrete evidence that directly linked the woman to the crime. No fingerprints on the bottle, no confession, no witnesses, yet the town didn't care. They believed the narrative because it was simple and easy to digest. The woman had motive. They were told she was a servant, and the mayor had mistreated her. What more did they need to know? They had already decided she was guilty, and the prosecutor's words confirmed it. The prosecutor didn't bother to address the inconsistencies in the case. He didn't ask why a poor servant girl earning barely $2 a week would go to the trouble of poisoning a man who paid her. He didn't question the fact that the mayor's will had been hastily rewritten just days before his death, leaving everything to a mysterious benefactor. The mayor's estranged sons were cut out, leaving no clear explanation for why the mayor would suddenly change his mind about his inheritance. But none of this mattered to the prosecutor or the townsfolk. The narrative was already set, and the gaps in the story were conveniently ignored. The woman sitting quietly in the defendant's chair could feel the weight of the prosecutor's words pressing down on her, but she said nothing. She had long since learned that speaking out was futile. In this town where everyone had already decided who she was, no one would believe her anyway. Her silence, once a shield, now felt like a prison. She knew the prosecutor was lying, but it didn't matter. No one would listen to her, and no one cared to hear the truth. They had already decided she was guilty, and their minds were closed to anything that might contradict the story they had been told. As the prosecutor wrapped up his case, he turned his attention to the jury, urging them to deliver the verdict they already knew to be true. The woman's fate was sealed not by facts or evidence, but by the narrative that had been constructed around her. She was the villain, the murderer, the scapegoat, for a town too eager to look the other way when it came to the truth. The prosecutor's words had struck their mark, and the townsfolk were eager to see the end of the trial, to move on with their lives, and to forget that anyone had ever questioned the simple, clean version of events he had presented. But deep down, the prosecutor knew there were questions that remained unanswered. He knew the evidence didn't quite add up, that the mayor's decline had been gradual and unexplained. He knew the mayor's will had been rewritten under mysterious circumstances. But those were details he didn't care about. They didn't fit into the narrative he had chosen to tell. In Hollow Rock, the truth didn't matter as much as the story. and the prosecutor had crafted a tale that everyone could accept. As the gavel slammed down and the judge adjourned the trial, the woman was led out of the courtroom. Her head bowed her silence, more powerful than any defense she could have offered. The prosecutor had won. But the truth, the one thing he had never bothered to uncover, remained buried in the shadows, waiting to be brought into the light. At the same time, Cole Cross walked into town like a shadow, his presence announced not by fanfare or greetings but by a quiet, unsettling silence that followed him wherever he went. He had been gone for years, vanished without a trace, a name spoken in whispers and cautionary tales. In a town like Hollow Rock where gossip ran thicker than the dust on the streets, the return of a man like Cole Cross was bound to stir things up. He wasn't a man you noticed right away, but you certainly felt him when he entered a room. His boots made no sound as they hit the wooden floor of the saloon. He wore a dusty coat, and his hat was pulled low, casting a shadow over his eyes. The revolver hanging at his hip seemed like an extension of his body, a quiet promise that he was not a man to be trifled with. He didn't sit at the bar, didn't order a drink. Instead, he took a seat in the back, his eyes never leaving the door. People glanced at him from across the room but quickly turned their heads, pretending they hadn't seen him at all. The saloon was far from empty, but there was an air of tension that filled the room. No one was sure what to make of Cole's return. He wasn't just any gunslinger, he was a legend. Stories about him circulated like wildfire, each one darker than the last. Some said he was the fastest draw west of the Black Hills. Others claimed he had a cold, unrelenting fury that only surfaced when it was time to kill. He had once been a bounty hunter for hire, taking on jobs that others were too afraid to even consider. But then, he disappeared. No one knew where he went or what became of him. But now here he was, sitting in the corner of the saloon, like a ghost, come back to life. As the whispers of his return spread through the town, the sheriff and the deputy kept their distance, their eyes warily fixed on the gunslinger. They knew better than to approach him. No one could forget the way Cole Cross had left town all those years ago after a bloody night that no one dared to speak of. The sheriff himself had seen what Cole was capable of, and he had no intention of provoking him. Still, something about his return felt different. There was no wild-eyed rage in the air, no immediate threat. Just the quiet, constant pressure of a storm waiting to break. Cole didn't acknowledge anyone in the saloon. He didn't need to. He wasn't here to make friends or raise a ruckus. He was here for a reason, and he knew it would become clear soon enough. His return was no coincidence. He had come back to Hollow Rock for the woman Clara. Everyone in town knew she was the one on trial for the mayor's murder, and they knew that Cole had a history with Mayor Frederick Hawk. The connection between them was shrouded in mystery, but the rumors ran wild. Some said that Cole had once been hired by the mayor to deal with a rival in the town, a job that had left a trail of blood and whispers behind it. Others claimed Cole had been a close associate of Hawk's, a man who operated in the shadows. No matter the truth, one thing was clear. Cole Cross was a man whose return spelled trouble for those who had hidden the truth for so long. He wasn't interested in the gossip or the speculation. He was here for answers, and he wasn't going to leave until he got them. As the hours passed, Cole remained a still figure in the back of the saloon, watching the door as if waiting for something. His eyes were sharp, taking in every movement, every whisper. The people in the saloon kept their distance, but they couldn't help but watch him. Even the sheriff, who had spent years trying to keep control of the town, knew better than to challenge Cole directly. The moment the gavel had slammed down in the courtroom, sealing the woman's fate, Cole had risen from his seat without a word. He didn't have to say much. His reputation preceded him. Everyone in town knew who he was, even if they were too afraid to acknowledge it. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he did speak, people listened. By the time he entered the courtroom the next morning, the town was already buzzing with nervous energy. The woman's trial had been a spectacle, a performance for the townsfolk who were hungry for scandal. But now, with Cole Cross back in town, the tone had changed. No one was sure what he was planning, but they all knew it couldn't be good for the people who had allowed this injustice to unfold. As he walked into the courtroom, his presence was like a physical force, shifting the atmosphere in the room. He didn't need to announce himself. The people in the room simply felt it. The judge faltered for a moment as Cole approached, his usual air of authority slipping as he tried to regain control of the situation. The prosecutor, who had been so sure of his case, now hesitated. his confident words faltering under the weight of Cole's gaze. "I'm here for the truth," Cole said quietly, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight. It was all he needed to say. Everyone in the room turned their attention to him, waiting for the storm to break. The townsfolk who had already written the woman off as guilty now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Cole's return wasn't just a man coming back to settle an old score. It was a reckoning, and it was clear that the truth, the one everyone had ignored for so long, was about to be brought into the light. As Cole stood there waiting for the moment to arrive, he knew that this was more than just about Clara. It was about the town itself. Hollow Rock had buried its secrets deep, but now, with Cole Cross back, those secrets were coming to the surface, and the people of Hollow Rock would have to reckon with the past they had tried so hard to forget. The courtroom was heavy with tension as Cole Cross stood at the front, his presence commanding every eye in the room. The town of Hollow Rock had already made up its mind. The woman, Clara, was guilty. The prosecutor had painted her as a bitter servant, a jealous woman who had poisoned the mayor out of resentment. No one had questioned the narrative. No one had cared enough to look deeper to ask why or how or whether the story they were so eagerly devouring could be true. But now, with Cole Cross stepping forward, everything was about to change. He didn't speak at first, just stood there, his eyes fixed on the jury, then slowly turned his gaze to the judge. The room was silent, the kind of silence that carries the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The judge, a man who had been content to let the trial proceed without question, felt an uncomfortable stir in his stomach. This wasn't the usual procedure. This wasn't a man who followed the rules of the courtroom. This was Cole Cross, the gunslinger, the man whose name was whispered with both fear and reverence. "Cole Cross," the prosecutor said, his voice cracking slightly. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here to speak the truth," Cole replied, his voice low but steady. His words hung in the air like the stillness before a storm. Something this town seems to have forgotten. Clara, who had sat silently throughout the trial, her face pale and emotionless, finally looked up. Her eyes met Cole's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of recognition in them. She had heard his name before, whispered in fear, mentioned in hushed tones by those who knew the mayor's secrets. But now, as Cole Cross stood before the jury, she knew he wasn't here to punish her. He was here to defend her, to show the world the truth they had ignored. The prosecutor scoffed. "The truth? You're a wanted man. You have no business in this courtroom. What can you possibly know about the crime she's being accused of?" Cole didn't flinch. "I know more than you think," he said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to face the jury, his eyes hardening. "I was there. I saw what happened. I heard her cry out for help, and I did nothing." He paused, his words sinking into the silence of the room. "But that was before I understood the truth of what she was going through." The room shifted uncomfortably. The townsfolk had all heard the rumors about Cole Cross, but to hear him speak so openly, to admit to standing by while a woman was hurt, was jarring. It was the kind of truth no one wanted to hear, especially not in a town that had already made its judgments. "I was hired by the mayor," once Cole continued, his voice steady as he spoke, revealing the past that no one had dared to ask about. "He didn't hire me to protect him from criminals or thieves. He hired me to intimidate people, to keep his secrets buried." He looked directly at the jury. He had a lot of secrets. Clara's eyes flickered toward Cole, the tiniest sign of recognition. He was the one the mayor had hired to threaten his rivals, the man who had been part of the darkness surrounding Hawk's life. But now Cole was standing up for her. "I witnessed the abuse she suffered," Cole said, his voice dropping lower. "She wasn't just a servant to Mayor Hawk. She was his prisoner. His possessions, his violence, they were all part of her life. He used her. He abused her. And no one, not the sheriff, not the doctor, not anyone in this town ever said a word. You all looked away." The words hit the room like a slap. The townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The baker, the cook, the stable boy, they all knew what Cole was talking about. They had seen the signs, the bruises on Clara's skin, the way she walked with her head down, the way she flinched whenever someone came near. They had known, but they had chosen to do nothing. Cole took a step forward, his voice rising with every word. "The mayor struck her. more than once, and every time she had no choice but to stay because she had nowhere else to go. No family, no friends, no one to help her. She was a woman alone, living under the thumb of a cruel man. A man who made sure no one would speak for her, not even in a courtroom. The prosecutor opened his mouth to interrupt, but Cole held up a hand, silencing him. "I'm not finished," Cole said, his eyes hardening. He turned back to the jury, his gaze piercing. "You all know what it means to survive. You've all been through your own hardships, your own struggles. But none of you had to live the way Clara did. You didn't have to endure the kind of violence she lived with every day, and yet you're willing to condemn her because she didn't cry, because she didn't beg for Clara." Cole's words stung like a whip, each sentence a reminder of the town's complicity. No one had stopped the mayor. No one had stepped in to help. Instead, they all watched, and now they were ready to hang Clara for a crime she didn't commit. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper. "I have something else," he said, his voice calm, but firm. "This is a medical report from the town doctor signed by him. It shows the bruises, the broken ribs, the injuries that Clara sustained over the years. It shows the truth that you've all ignored." The document passed from hand to hand, finally reaching the judge, who read it in silence. The courtroom was still, every eye fixed on Cole as he spoke the words they had all been too afraid to say. Clara didn't kill the mayor. She didn't poison him. She didn't do anything except try to survive in a world that wanted her to disappear. The room was silent as the judge looked down at the paper in his hand. The truth had been laid bare. There was no hiding it anymore. The jury, who had been so sure of Clara's guilt, now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. The prosecutor had painted a picture of a bitter, vengeful servant, but Cole had torn that picture apart piece by piece, revealing the woman behind the accusation. A woman who had suffered in silence, a woman who had been ignored by the very people who should have protected her. For the first time in the entire trial, Clara's hands shook. Not from fear, but from something else. A recognition that for the first time in her life, someone was speaking for her. Someone was finally telling the truth. And with that truth, the weight of the past began to lift piece by piece, until it was nothing more than dust settling on the floor. As Cole Cross's words hung in the air, the weight of truth was settling over the courtroom, like a thick fog. The townsfolk who had once been so quick to condemn Clara now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The courtroom, once filled with whispers and gossip, was now heavy with silence. But it wasn't just Cole Cross's testimony that was changing the course of this trial. It was the voices of the very people who had once ignored Clara's suffering, who had looked the other way, and now at last were stepping forward to reveal the truth they had kept hidden for so long. The first voice came from the back of the room. It was an old woman, the bakery owner, her hands trembling as she stood, her eyes casting a glance toward the floor before meeting Cole's gaze. She was the first to break the silence, her voice wavering with emotion. "I saw the bruises," she said softly but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I saw them on her arms. She used to come to the bakery to fetch bread, and she'd always cover them up. She'd smile, but it was a smile that never reached her eyes." The room shifted as the townsfolk began to take notice. The woman's words were like a crack in the dam, and the floodgates were about to open. The baker continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I knew what was happening. I knew he was hurting her, but I didn't say anything. No one did. We all turned a blind eye. We all thought that if we stayed quiet, we could keep our lives safe. But we didn't help her. And now, look where we are." Her admission was followed by a murmur from the crowd. Some of the townspeople shifted uneasily, avoiding eye contact with each other as though ashamed of their own inaction. No one had thought to speak up. No one had wanted to risk their own position in the town to help someone who had been silenced for so long. But now the truth was undeniable, and it was time for the rest of the town to face what they had allowed to happen. Next, the housemaid stood, her face pale with guilt. She had been the one to tend to the mayor's chambers, to clean the rooms he had occupied, to keep the house running smoothly. She had seen it all, and now she too could no longer stay silent. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I cleaned his chamber pot when she had a fever," she said, her hands wringing together in front of her. "I begged him to let her rest, but he wouldn't. He made her work, even when she was sick. even when she could barely stand. And when she finally broke a dish, he struck her. He didn't care. She was nothing more than a servant to him. But she never complained. She never said a word. The housemaid paused, tears welling up in her eyes. I should have said something, she whispered more to herself than anyone else. I should have done something. But I didn't. I stayed silent too. Her admission sent a ripple of guilt through the room, and more eyes began to lower in shame. The housemaid had been complicit just as much as everyone else. She had witnessed the abuse and said nothing. She had allowed it to continue, and now she had to live with the knowledge of her own silence. Then, to everyone's surprise, the town doctor stood. His face was ashen, and his hands shook slightly as he held up a crumpled piece of paper. I treated her more than once, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But I never filed the proper records. I never spoke up. I was afraid of what might happen to me if I did. The mayor was a powerful man, and I was just a doctor. What would they do to me if I spoke out? His eyes flickered with guilt. I lied by omission, and I am just as guilty as anyone else. I was afraid of losing my practice, of losing my place in this town. So I stayed quiet, and I let it happen. The room fell into stunned silence. The doctor, a man who had sworn an oath to do no harm, had failed to protect Clara when she had needed him most. He had let the mayor's cruelty continue, and now for the first time, he was acknowledging his role in it. The doctor's confession weighed heavily on the crowd, and they couldn't help but wonder how many others had known the truth and done nothing. As the doctor sat down, the sheriff, a man who had once been sympathetic to Clara, but had never taken action, stood as well. He was a tall figure, his face etched with years of hard work and responsibility. But today he seemed smaller, more vulnerable, as though the weight of his inaction was finally catching up to him. I saw the cut on her lip, the sheriff said, his voice low and steady. I asked her if she wanted to press charges. She said no. She said it would make things worse, and she was right. He looked down at his hands, which were trembling. I didn't do anything. I let it go on too. I didn't help her. His confession was the final blow. The room was silent, save for the quiet sobs from the women in the jury. No one in Hollow Rock had been innocent. They had all known about the abuse, had all seen the signs, but they had chosen to look the other way. They had all stood by, allowing Clara to suffer in silence until it was too late to save her, and now they had to confront their complicity. Clara sat in the witness chair, her eyes vacant as the truth of her suffering unfolded around her. She hadn't said a word. She hadn't needed to. The town was finally acknowledging what they had all known deep down, but had been too afraid to admit. She had been abused, she had been silenced. And now the people who had once turned their backs on her were facing the consequences of their own inaction. For the first time in the entire trial, the townsfolk were forced to reckon with their own guilt. They had all contributed to Clara's suffering, either by participating in the cruelty or by standing by and doing nothing. They had allowed her to become the scapegoat, the woman they could blame for their own shortcomings. But now, as the truth was laid bare, they couldn't escape it. They couldn't hide from their complicity any longer. The courtroom was no longer a place of judgment, but a place of reckoning. The townspeople who had once been so quick to condemn Clara were now forced to confront the reality of what they had allowed to happen. It was no longer about the crime they had accused her of. It was about the larger crime. They had all committed the crime of turning a blind eye, of ignoring the suffering of someone who had been powerless to stop it. Clara didn't speak. She didn't need to. The truth had been revealed, and for the first time the people of Hollow Rock were forced to see her, not as the servant girl they had dismissed, but as a woman who had suffered at their hands. And as the whispers of guilt and shame grew louder, the town was forever changed. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence as Cole Cross stepped forward, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Every eye in the room was on him, but none of them dared to speak as he approached the center of the room with a calm, deliberate pace. For a moment it seemed as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The judge, having regained a semblance of authority after the flood of revelations from the townsfolk, looked at Cole with a mix of disdain and curiosity. The sheriff stood on edge, wary of the gunslinger's presence, but there was little he could do to stop him now. Cole's voice, low and steady, broke the tension that had enveloped the room. "She's my wife," He declared his words cutting through the air like a blade. The statement hung in the room like a thunderclap, shocking everyone to their core. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath them, and the very foundations of their beliefs and accusations were now trembling. The judge blinked in disbelief. "What did you say?" he demanded, trying to regain control over the situation. His face reddened with indignation as he leaned forward in his seat. "This is a court of law, not a saloon for wild stories." But Cole didn't flinch. His eyes were unwavering, cold and firm as he met the judge's glare. "I said, she's my wife, and you're interrupting official court business." The room was filled with murmurs, the town's residents whispering among themselves, their heads spinning with the revelation, a servant girl, a woman. They had all branded guilty, now had a husband. The very notion seemed impossible to many of them. How could this be? Why had they not known? Why had no one spoken for her? And more importantly, why had Cole Cross, the feared gunslinger and bounty hunter, returned to defend her? Now Cole didn't let the room settle in confusion for long. He reached into his coat slowly, and with a deliberate motion, he pulled out a folded piece of paper. The sheriff standing by the door stepped forward, eyes narrowed with suspicion. Cole handed the document to him without a word. The sheriff unfolded it with trembling hands, reading it twice in rapid succession, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing word. The paper was a marriage certificate dated 2 years ago from Deuce Creek, 3 towns over. The townsfolk gasped collectively, their eyes darting from the paper to Cole, then to the woman seated in the chair still silent, her head bowed. The judge's hands gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. He looked up from the document, his voice faltering. "Even if this is true, and I doubt it, it has no bearing on her guilt." "Of course it does," Cole replied, his voice cutting through the noise. "It has everything to do with why she was left alone." He turned to face the jury and the townspeople, his eyes locking with each one, daring them to meet his gaze. "You all watched her suffer, and did nothing. You all turned your backs on her because it was easier to stay quiet than to confront the truth. There was no denying it. The truth had already begun to settle in the hearts of those who had been complicit in the injustice. The mayor's death, the whispers of scandal, and the false narrative they had allowed to take root. All of it was a lie they had all been part of either through their silence or by allowing it to go unchecked. Cole's presence and his quiet but powerful declaration forced them to reckon with the reality they had been avoiding. The judge, still flustered and trying to regain control, scoffed. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice barely more than a rasp, but Cole, standing firm, refused to allow him to dismiss the moment. "I'm not here for romance," Cole responded, his tone hard, cold. "I'm here because you all lied. You lied to her, to yourselves, and to the truth. All these years you allowed her to be nothing more than a shadow, someone you could blame, someone you could forget. You watched her suffer, and you did nothing." As Cole spoke, the town felt the weight of his words, felt the truth seep in like a slow-moving river carving its way through hardened earth. Clara, the woman who had been vilified, degraded and abandoned, was no longer invisible. She was a person with a name, a life, and now a husband who would stand by her no matter what. The truth was no longer something they could hide from, no longer something they could suppress with gossip and judgment. The jury looked at one another, the conviction they had felt just moments before beginning to fade as the reality of their complicity settled in. The judge, no longer able to hide from the truth, cleared his throat, but there was no more authority in his voice. "This is a court of law, not a theater for spectacle," he muttered, but even his words rang hollow. Behind him, Cole remained a pillar of calm strength. "Let the truth speak for itself," he said softly, his gaze never leaving the judge. And for the first time in the entire trial, the judge couldn't bring himself to finish the sentence. As the room filled with an uncomfortable silence, the sheriff stepped forward, holding the marriage certificate, his face pale and unsure. He looked at the woman, then at Cole. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I didn't know. None of us knew. Doesn't matter now." Cole said, his voice steady but heavy with finality. "It's too late for excuses, but it's not too late for her." In that moment, Cole Cross, the feared gunslinger, did more than just reveal a secret. He reminded the town of Hollow Rock, of its own shame, of its collective failure to act. And in doing so, he forced them to reckon with the truth they had buried for so long. The woman was no longer just a servant. She was someone who had been wronged, someone who had been invisible but was finally seen. And as the truth unfolded in that small courtroom, the townsfolk could do nothing but listen, and for the first time in their lives perhaps even feel a flicker of what it meant to be human. The courtroom, once thick with tension and whispered judgments, fell into a heavy silence as the woman slowly rose from her seat. Her movements were deliberate, almost cautious, as if she were testing the waters of her newfound voice. For the first time since the trial began, she looked up, her eyes meeting the crowd not with the vacant resignation of a victim, but with something sharper, something that had long been buried under layers of silence and fear. Her face, pale and hollow from the long days in the cell, showed the faintest signs of strength, a quiet but undeniable shift. Her voice, when it came, was soft but unwavering, cutting through the murmur of the room like a blade. "I didn't kill him," she said, her words hanging in the air, heavy with years of unspoken truth. "I wanted to many times," she continued, her voice trembling slightly but not with fear. "But I didn't." The judge, momentarily taken aback by her words, looked at her with a mix of disbelief and confusion. His hand hovered over his gavel, unsure whether he should cut her off or allow her to speak. The townsfolk, who had been so sure of her guilt, now listened intently, as if finally realizing that the woman they had condemned was about to share something none of them had considered before. "I begged for help," she continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "I prayed. I stayed silent because I thought it would keep me safe." Her eyes flicked over to the jury, then to the townspeople who had watched her trial with a mix of curiosity and judgment. But it didn't. It only kept me invisible. She paused, her gaze locking with the judge. For the first time, she wasn't speaking to the crowd or to the jury. She was speaking directly to the man who had sat in judgment over her life, who had made decisions about her future without ever truly seeing her. "The mayor," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He was cruel. He wasn't a man of honor. He used his kindness as a weapon, and when that wasn't enough, he used his power." The room held its breath as the woman shared her story, a story that had been silenced for so long. She spoke of the bruises hidden beneath her clothes, of the long nights she spent scrubbing floors, her hands raw and aching while the mayor dined with guests and enjoyed the luxuries of his wealth. She spoke of the times he had struck her, not for any reason she could understand, but because he could. And after every blow, he would pay her more, as if that was supposed to make it better. As if money could erase the shame of being treated like less than a person. "I never cried," she said, her voice growing softer but still carrying the weight of her words, "because every time I did, he only laughed. Every time I begged, he told me I was worthless. But I wasn't. I was just trying to survive." The room was still, and for the first time people weren't whispering. They weren't murmuring about the woman's guilt or making assumptions about her character. They were listening. They were hearing her for the first time as she spoke. Her body, once so rigid with fear, began to relax. Her shoulders, which had been hunched for so long, straightened. The chains that bound her didn't feel quite as heavy as they had before. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't invisible. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was carrying the weight of the world on her own. Her eyes flicked briefly toward Cole Cross, standing in the back of the courtroom, his presence a silent promise that she wasn't forgotten, that she wasn't alone in this fight. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained control. "I stayed silent because I thought I had no choice," she said, her gaze now sweeping the room. "But I do have a choice now. I have a voice, and I will use it." The townspeople shifted in their seats, their eyes flickering from one another as the full weight of her words began to settle over them. They had all been complicit, all too eager to condemn her without ever knowing her truth. The prosecutor, who had painted her as a cold and calculating killer, now sat in stunned silence, his words no longer having the same power over the room. The judge, who had watched her trial with detachment, seemed to soften for a moment, though he quickly masked it behind a facade of professionalism. "You may sit down," he said, though his voice lacked the authority it had once held. He wasn't in control anymore. She did not sit down immediately. Instead, she stood tall, her gaze unwavering, as if she was daring the town to see her for who she truly was. A woman who had been broken by circumstance, but not defeated. A woman who had been silenced for so long but was finally speaking her truth. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness," she said, her voice steady now, no longer trembling. "I'm asking for the truth to be heard. I'm asking for justice, not for me, but for everyone who has been silenced, for everyone who has been forgotten." With that, she sat back down, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her chin lifted slightly, as if to show the world that she was no longer the invisible servant, the girl no one cared about. She was a woman with a voice, a woman who had suffered, but was now standing tall, refusing to be anyone's victim any longer. The room was still, the silence deafening, but it was a silence that carried with it the weight of truth, a truth that had been buried beneath the surface for far too long, and now for the first time had finally been allowed to surface. As the woman's voice echoed through the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted, as if a veil had been lifted from the eyes of the townspeople. For the first time they saw her not as the quiet servant girl who had lived in the shadow of the mayor's mansion, but as a person, a woman who had endured years of cruelty and abuse. The truth that had been buried under layers of gossip, silence, and misunderstanding was now being laid bare for all to see. The room, once filled with judgment and whispers, now fell into a contemplative silence. The townspeople, who had so easily accepted the prosecutor's narrative, found themselves unable to ignore the weight of the testimonies that had been shared. The housemaid, the baker's wife, the piano player, and even the town doctor. Each one had spoken up, recounting the moments they had witnessed, but had failed to act upon. They had all known in their own way about the mayor's cruelty, but no one had done anything. They had all allowed it to continue, complicit in their silence. Now, as the truth unfolded, their guilt began to settle over them like a heavy cloud. They realized, perhaps for the first time, how their failure to act had contributed to the woman's suffering. They had watched her endure the mayor's abuse without lifting a finger to help, and now, in the face of undeniable evidence, they could no longer pretend they had not seen. The woman, once an invisible figure in the town's eyes, had become a symbol of their own moral failure. The judge, who had initially seemed so certain of the woman's guilt, now found himself in an uncomfortable position. His old friend, the mayor, had been a pillar of the town, and yet the evidence that had come to light, especially the testimonies of those who had been silent for so long, could not be ignored. The judge glanced at the jury, but their faces were no longer filled with conviction. They too had seen the truth, and it was clear that their initial judgment had been clouded by preconceived notions, by the town's collective indifference to the woman's suffering. The prosecutor, who had painted the woman as a bitter servant seeking revenge, now stood silent. His arguments, once so persuasive, had been shredded by the testimonies and the undeniable truth of the woman's experiences. The town, once so certain of her guilt, now found themselves questioning everything they had believed. They had been ready to condemn her without ever considering her side of the story, and now they were left to confront their own complicity in the injustice. As the court session drew to a close, the judge stood and addressed the room. "The new evidence and the testimonies we've heard today are undeniable," he said, his voice lacking the usual authority it once held. "This trial will be adjourned for further review. No formal verdict will be read at this time." The words hung in the air, an acknowledgement that the trial, which had seemed so certain from the beginning, had unraveled before their eyes. The townspeople began to slowly file out of the courtroom, their minds heavy with the weight of what they had just witnessed. No one spoke, but the air was thick with the realization that they had failed this woman. The whispers that had once filled the town's streets, whispers of her guilt, of her supposed crime, now seemed distant and hollow. The woman who had once been a nameless servant had become a person again, her humanity restored by the truth she had shared. For the first time, the townspeople began to see her as she truly was, not the quiet, invisible servant of the mayor, but a woman who had endured unimaginable pain and who had finally found her voice. The trial, which had been a spectacle of judgment and condemnation, had turned into something else entirely. It had become a moment of reckoning, not just for the woman, but for the town itself. They had all played a part in her suffering, and now they would have to live with the consequences of their silence. The courthouse emptied, but the change in the town had already begun. The woman, once silent and forgotten, was no longer alone. She had spoken, and the truth had set her free, not just from the chains of her past, but from the town that had once turned its back on her. After the trial, the town of Hollow Rock seemed to hold its breath as Cole and the woman walked away, leaving behind the courthouse, the judge and the townsfolk who had once condemned her. The weight of the past hung heavily in the air, but in the quiet steps they took together, there was a sense of something new, something not yet defined but full of promise. They didn't speak, but there was an understanding between them. The woman, once silenced and invisible to the world, now walked freely beside someone who had seen her not as a servant, but as a person worthy of dignity and respect. Their journey took them beyond the town, and they found themselves at a small tavern, a quiet place where the world seemed to stop for a moment. The fire crackled softly in the corner, and the room was dimly lit by a single lantern. It was here in this humble setting that the woman finally felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. She wasn't running from her past, nor was she hiding from the judgment of others. For the first time, she could simply breathe. Cole sat across from her, his presence steady and unwavering. He didn't ask her to talk. He didn't expect anything from her. His silence was comfortable, and it allowed her to rest in a way she hadn't been able to for years. He didn't press for answers, but in his quiet strength he offered her something invaluable, a chance to heal, to reclaim the parts of herself that had been lost in the years of abuse and neglect. She stared into the fire, her thoughts drifting back to the life she had left behind, the days filled with fear and loneliness. But now the flames before her weren't a symbol of destruction. They were a light leading her towards something new. Her eyes, once guarded and distant, softened, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Cole's quiet companionship had broken through the walls she had built around herself. It wasn't love? Not yet. Not in the traditional sense, but it was something real. They had both been survivors of their own battles, and in each other they found a quiet understanding. They didn't need words to define what had passed between them. It was enough to be there together without expectation, without fear. As the night wore on, the woman and Cole remained in the quiet comfort of the tavern, their shared silence speaking volumes. For her, it wasn't just an escape, it was a rebirth. She was no longer the girl in chains, no longer the woman judged and condemned by a town that had never bothered to understand her. She was someone new, someone who could now look forward, not just backward. When they finally stood to leave the weight of Hollow Rock, the town that had once been her prison seemed to lift. They walked out into the night, their steps in sync, not with any destination in mind, but with the shared understanding that they were moving forward. The town was far behind them, a place filled with memories of injustice, but they weren't running from it. They were walking away toward a future where the woman could reclaim her life, her name, and her peace. And as they disappeared into the distance, the story of her trial of the town that had failed her became nothing more than a whisper in the past. For the woman and Cole, their future was not defined by the chains of yesterday, but by the quiet, steady steps they took together toward freedom. The story of the woman's trial and her eventual liberation holds powerful lessons about justice, silence, and the importance of standing up for what's right. One key takeaway is that silence, though often protective, can also be suffocating when it is born out of fear or neglect. The woman's struggle reminds us that everyone deserves to be seen, heard, and believed, especially those who have suffered in silence. Often, we overlook the stories of the marginalized, but it is our duty to speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. Another vital lesson is the significance of personal redemption and the power of a second chance. Just as the woman's life changed when someone chose to see her beyond her circumstances, we too can offer others opportunities to start anew, free from past judgments. In a world that often favors convenience over truth, this story encourages us to question assumptions, confront injustice, and most importantly, show compassion to those who have been overlooked or oppressed. By doing so, we can create a more understanding and just world for everyone.